had she just blundered into the crisis? The children were an even sorrier sight than the grown-ups. Maybe because they were kids in their pajamas and it was Christmas, and their innocence had been destroyed. Young Trey was sucking his thumb. Chloe hugged a throw pillow that featured holly, red ribbons, and bells. Her twin, Jeremy, stared at nothing. I saw a dark stain on his pajama pants and realized the poor kid had been so frightened and humiliated by his father that he'd peed his pants. So I already hated Fowler when he came around in front of me and showed me just how far he'd fallen since his glory days on K Street and in the courtroom. In place of the Italian suits he'd favored, he wore filthy jeans and a torn army surplus jacket. He lost 50 or 60 pounds since those days. His eyes were sunken in his head. Several of his teeth were missing. There were scabs on his face that had been picked at and oozed. He carried a Glock 19 and a Remington shotgun that had been crudely sawed off. Fowler stared at me for an uncomfortable few seconds. Then he smiled, really showing off the rotting gaps where his teeth had been.
You have time for a joke, Cross? Lighten things up a bit? Holiday spirit and all that.
Chapter 18. I was beginning to feel it. The turmoil Fowler seemed to secrete from every pore. I could smell it, too. He reeked of that weird, sour body odor that follows crazy people who live on the street too long.
So, there's this ignorant, oblivious man. He's sitting on the veranda of his rented bungalow in St. John's with his trophy wife. Beautiful sunset, glowing tans. They're drinking from a marvelous bottle of Burgundy Grand Cru from the Côte d'Or. His wife says, "I love you." The man looks over and says, "Is that you talking or is it the wine?" She looks at him as if he's a fool and says, "Actually, dear, I was talking to the wine."
Fowler looked around the room. Nobody was laughing. If anything, they were all even more terrified than before he told his joke.
You remember that, don't you, Diana?
No, Henry, I don't,
she said. He smiled in a threatening way.
Of course you do. And if you don't, you should. It's so emblematic of who we were that...
Stop it!
Diana screamed.
You've got to stop this, Henry. At least, let the children go.
Don't be a party pooper, Diana. Show the spirit of the season,
Fowler said, waving her off before looking at me.
My dear ex-wife has never dealt well with reality or the truth, as you shall hear, Cross.
I couldn't let this go any farther. She's right, Henry. Why don't you let your children go? It's Christmas, a hard time, but don't take it out on them. He leveled the pistol at me.
Why shouldn't I take it out on them, Cross? They're the ones who drove me here. They and their uncaring, greedy, materialistic mother. The biggest mistake of my life.
Mister? I heard a child's voice. It was Trey. He was looking at me. Mister, can you ask Daddy to go back to his house so Santa can come? Before I could deliver any words of comfort, Fowler walked over and jammed his black-booted foot on the boy's ear.
Shut up, Trey, or we'll be playing Hide the Skippy Super Chunk. Besides, I told you, I'm going no place.
Fowler looked at me, scratched at his face, said,
Kids, they never listen.
I'd begun to compile a catalog of Fowler's tics and twitches. The face scratching, the hand rubbing, the massaging of the back of his neck, the quick bite to the side of his ring finger on his left hand. If he sat next to you on the metro, you'd stand up quickly, move away, and get off at the next station. He picked up the phone on the end table next to my chair and hit redial. I heard a voice say, "This is Ramiro." Fowler laid the receiver on the table. "It's Cross," I said. "I'm all right."
Now that the jury has been seated, are we ready to hear opening statements?
Fowler said, looking at me. I hesitated, then nodded.
Excellent.
Fowler said, rubbing the back of his gun hand.
Let's begin with an introduction. Diana, sweetheart, kids, Barry. This is the famous Alex Cross. He will be the jury foreman for these proceedings.
His words had lost their frantic quality and now flowed with the easy delivery of a top-flight defense attorney. Despite all the drugs and self-abuse, this madman had polish and brains, which made him even scarier to me.
Court is now in session.
Fowler intoned in a deep voice as if he were a bailiff.
The Honorable Grinch who stole Christmas presiding.
Chapter 19. Fowler began marching around the room, singing a song about the mean old Grinch at the top of his lungs. Then he stopped next to his ex-wife and put his boot on her back.
First up in the box,
Fowler said, looking at me.
The evil mastermind behind my destruction, Diana Alstead Fowler Nicholson.
Henry,
she said, and began to whimper.
Hush now, Diana. I'll talk for you. If I get anything wrong, you just speak up.
He looked up.
The fair Diana Alstead was originally from Charleston, South Carolina. Daughter of parents born into multi-generational wealth, she grew up in a life of ease. The expectation of immediate material gratification, simply a part of her DNA. She attended the finest schools, Choate, Rosemary Hall, and then Georgetown. There she meets this kid on full scholarship. Henry Fowler is beneath her station in life, but he shows promise. He's majoring in chemistry and English and wins entry to the Georgetown Law School. She sees he's a hard-working guy and latches onto him like a leech in a swamp.
Diana was looking at me with this pitiful expression as she cried,
that's not true, Henry. I loved you.
Oh, boo-hoo, Cindy Lou-hoo. We're telling the truth here, not repeating old fantasies. I had almost 20 years to study this particular specimen, Mr. Foreman. Here is my expert testimony. Diana is that woman at the Sotheby's Jade auction, bidding far too much for a $10,000 green statue of a water buffalo or a yak, I'm not sure which. She's that woman who sets her authentic Regency dining table with $2,000 James Robinson place settings. She's the type they fawn over at Bloomy's and Bergdorf Goodman. The woman whose skinny little ass they kiss at Prada. The woman they serve tea to in private rooms at Tiffany in Washington and New York. Yes, my ex is quite the gal. Hey, she shared her genes with me to create this winning trio,
he said, gesturing to his children.
You've already met Trey, who's never met an allergy or affliction he didn't adore. Sick all the time, right from birth, pneumonia then. You name a childhood disease and my boy has had it. Meets with top medical specialists 2-3 times a week. Best that money can buy. Isn't that right, son?
Trey began to snivel. I can't help it, Dad.
Of course you can't. Most of your mother's defective DNA strands just happened to spool out to you, and those that didn't found their way into your older brother and sister.
He smiled at me.
I'm a lucky man, Cross.
That's so? I asked, hoping he'd continue to vent, expend his emotional energy, and then see the hopelessness of his situation before the meth could turn him full rhino.
Isn't it obvious? Doesn't luck just seem to shimmer all around me?
It used to, I said. He looked off into the distance, said,
Yes, it did, before my surroundings and close companions conspired to warp me.
Here was paranoia, crystal meth's staple emotion. I could already hear the angry persecution story coming. Fowler didn't let me down. Chapter 20. Fowler crossed to his son Jeremy and used his boot to push the boy over onto his back, where he cringed like a dog.
Here he is, my scion, the apple of my eye. Make that the apple strudel, cake, pie, and Pop-Tart of my eye, not to mention my favorite bedwetter. By the looks of it, he's regressing, pissing his pants now instead of his mattress.
The boy was humiliated. Jeremy began to make hiccuping noises that broke into chokes and sobs.
Stop, Daddy!
Chloe screamed.
You're making it worse! You're ruining everything! You always ruin everything!
Ah, Chloe. My little Miss Perfect.
He looked to me.
Chloe is exceptionally smart, a trait that no doubt came from my end of things, but that intelligence crossed with my ex-wife's narcissism produced a young lady who tries to control the world as if it orbited around her head.
I get it, Henry. Your kids didn't turn out the way you planned. Welcome to the club. It's what makes them human. And the disappointment? That's your issue. Deal with it. He looked surprised. Then his eyes narrowed and he snarled,
Who the fuck do you think you are, Dr. Phil?
Isn't that why you asked me in here?
I asked you in to serve as jury foreman. I'm running the show here, or haven't you noticed?
Look, I said, it's Christmas Eve. You obviously aren't happy with your life or your family, but I am happy. I have a family I love. I'd like to get back to them, so I'd appreciate it if you tell me what it was that broke you. Fowler didn't know what to make of that. He clearly hadn't expected it.
What are you talking about?
You were at the top of the game on K Street, making millions, making headlines, and then it all unravels, I said. I get the overspending, the consumerist wife, the messed up kids, but lots of guys in this town have those problems and they aren't holding their families hostage on Christmas Eve. So what was it? What caused you to unravel? Chapter 21. For a second there, I wondered if I'd gone too far, been too direct, too confrontational. But then Fowler smiled icily at me.
You want to know the straw that broke the camel's back cross?
He asked, reaching into his jacket and coming up with a glass vial. Wouldn't hurt to understand your side of things, I said. Fowler squatted by the glass coffee table, tapped white powder onto it, and started laying the powder out in lines with a hotel room key card.
I suppose that's a reasonable request, but I'm going to have to get my head on straight to tell that story.
He rolled up a $1 bill and snorted 2 of the 5 lines. Shuddering, he closed his eyes. Then he shivered and said,
Now that is more like it.
How long have you been up, Henry?
It doesn't matter. I'm seeing things clear and for what they are, Cross. So I'll tell you what you want to know about me going off the deep end.
Okay, I said, noticing the slight tremor that was visible in his fingers. If he had been shooting and snorting meth for more than, say, 36 hours, the rhino could be paying us a visit at any moment.
So, it's Christmas, not that many years ago. And we're home. We're happy. We hold a party the afternoon of Christmas Eve. It's been a big money year for me, and Diana spared no expense. Catered the whole 9 yards. And I don't know why, but it was one of those years when people stayed in D.C. for the holidays. Nearly everyone we knew came, even Barry, an old friend from Georgetown who arrived dressed as Santa Claus. Even dear Melissa and her husband, Congressman Brandywine, made an appearance. Anyway, about an hour into the festivities, I'm working the room. A potential client asks for a business card, and I go to my office. Door's locked. I knock. No one answers.
Fowler paused, snorted 2 more lines, then got to his feet and shrugged.
Locked door. It happens. I'll get it open later. But anyway, long story short, I go back to the party, apologize to my potential client, and promise to contact him after the new year. I get a drink, I'm looking around, the party's right at its peak. I get this weird feeling. So I go out the back door and around to the bulkhead below my office window. I look in, and what do I see?
Fowler walked over to stand by Dr. Nicholson. Then he booted the man hard in the ribs. Over the doctor's groaning, Fowler said,
This one's sitting in my Georgetown Law School rocking chair. Dear